A millionaire saw a pair of twins playing on the street, but when he took a closer look, his jaw dropped when the sharp hum of Henry Patterson's electric Porsche cut through the late afternoon traffic in Texas. The cityscape blurred past his windows, a muted amalgamation of towering skyscrapers and neon-drenched billboards. Henry barely noticed. As always, his mind functioned like a precise engine, sifting through data such as financial projections, product launches, and investor reports. He reduced everything else, including the buzz of life outside and the vibrant pulse of a city chasing its dreams, to white noise. Henry Patterson, at 35, was the embodiment of success. As the heir to a billion-dollar tech company, Henry had spent the last decade meticulously building his empire. His penthouse, perched high above the Texas skyline, reflected his life, modern, immaculate, and devoid of warmth. He meticulously tailored his wardrobe, calculated his meals for maximum efficiency, and meticulously planned his schedule. He thrived on precision, shunning anything that hinted at disorder or unpredictability. He had long since abandoned relationships. The occasional social engagement was tolerable, necessary even, for maintaining appearances. But the thought of entangling himself in the chaos of human emotion left him cold. Marriage? Children? Those were abstractions, neatly boxed away in the back of his mind, marked irrelevant. His colleagues sometimes whispered about his isolation, but their words never reached him. Henry had no patience for speculation, no tolerance for distraction. This afternoon, though, his routine cracked slightly. A business meeting had dragged longer than expected, leaving him hungrier than usual. With his favorite private chef unavailable, Henry found himself detouring to a diner he'd passed dozens of times, but never entered. It was small and unassuming, nestled between a laundromat and a pawnshop. The location felt out of place in his world. As he stepped inside, he was surprised by the quaint sound of the door jingling. The air smelled of grease and freshly brewed coffee, and the tables, though clean, showed signs of wear. A waitress in a faded apron greeted him with a practiced smile. "Take any seat, sugar," she said, her southern drawl cutting through the hum of conversation. Henry nodded curtly and chose a booth near the window. The vinyl cushion squeaked under him as he adjusted his tailored jacket. He skimmed the menu briefly: burgers, pancakes, endless variations of eggs, before ordering a black coffee and a grilled chicken sandwich. As he waited, his eyes drifted outside. Two boys, no older than 5, were chasing each other around a lamppost just beyond the diner's entrance. Their laughter was high-pitched and unrestrained, cutting through the dull roar of passing cars. They, with a mop of sandy blonde hair, darted behind the lamppost, only to peek out moments later with a grin that split his face. That twin, his mirror image, lunged after him, their matching blue sneakers pounding against the pavement. Henry froze. His grip on the coffee cup tightened as he stared at the boys. It wasn't just their playful energy or the way they moved in sync that held his attention. It was their faces, their cheekbones and eyes, sharp and piercing, mirrored his own. Their laughter revealed a subtle dimple. It was like looking into a photograph of himself, frozen in some impossible childhood he'd never had. The diner's noise faded to a muffled hum. Henry's heartbeat ticked unevenly, a steady counterpoint to the faint jangle of the boys' laughter. He blinked, certain that his mind was deceiving him, but upon re-examining, he found the boys still present, vibrant, and undeniably genuine. Questions swirled in his mind, tangled and jarring. Was it a coincidence? Was it just a coincidence, or was it a trick of the light? Could there be some distant relatives he was unaware of? His father, Walter, had never been forthcoming about family history, and Henry had never cared enough to pry. But here, on this ordinary day, in this ordinary diner, he faced an incomprehensible reality. The boys' laughter shifted. A person pointed at the other, who had tripped on the curb and was laughing harder. Henry exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. He didn't know these children. He didn't know their story. And yet, as he watched them scramble back to their feet, a pang of something unfamiliar clawed at his chest. It wasn't exactly fear or even curiosity, but a subtle ache, a sense of displacement, as if something had quietly rearranged his meticulously ordered world. The waitress returned with his sandwich, setting it down with a clatter. "Need anything else?" she asked brightly, breaking the spell. Henry shook his head, his voice tighter than usual. "No, thank you." He took a mechanical bite of his sandwich, his gaze flicking back to the window every few seconds. The boys were still there, their small hands now pressed against the glass of a nearby storefront as they pointed at something inside. He watched them until their mother, a woman with tired eyes and a calm authority, called them back to her side. Together, they disappeared down the street. Henry stared at the now empty spot on the sidewalk, the echo of their laughter still lingering in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt something slip beyond his control, and he hated it. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, but Henry Patterson hardly noticed as he sat in his office late into the evening. The city lights of Texas stretched beyond the vast windows behind him, glittering like constellations. Normally a symbol of precision and order, his desk was teeming with scattered notes and his untouched dinner. His mind was elsewhere, circling back time and again to the faces of those two boys. He leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. The resemblance had been uncanny, almost impossible. Yet the logical part of him, the part that thrived on data and reason, insisted there had to be a rational explanation. It wasn't as though he had a secret family tucked away somewhere. He had never let anyone close enough for that to happen. However, another possibility emerged. The memory rose unbidden, sharp, and unexpected. The clinic, years ago, a moment of impulsive altruism during the early days of his career. This was a time when his days were longer and his nights were shorter, when every dollar was important and everything was uncertain. It had seemed like such a harmless act, donating to a fertility bank. He had convinced himself it was a way to give back, though now he wondered if he'd truly understood the ramifications. The thought festered for hours, trailing him as he drove home, then settled into bed. By midnight, he was pacing the length of his living room, his reflection gliding along the glass walls like a shadow. Finally, as the city began to wind down, he grabbed his phone and dialed. The voice on the other end was groggy but familiar. "Henry," Dylan's voice cracked slightly. "You do realize it's—" There was a pause, followed by the sound of rustling sheets. "Almost 1 a.m? "I need to see you," Henry said, his tone sharper than intended. There was a sigh, tinged with equal parts annoyance and concern. "Can it wait until morning?" "No," Henry replied. "It's important." An hour later, Henry found himself in Dylan's modest home office, the stark contrast to his own sterile workspace, doing little to calm his nerves. Books lined every shelf, the air faintly scented with the earthy tang of old leather and pine. Dylan, still wearing a hastily donned sweatshirt over his pajamas, set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from Henry. "This had better be life or death," Dylan muttered, rubbing at his eyes. Henry hesitated, staring down into his coffee. The words felt absurd as he formed them. "Do you remember when I donated to your clinic?" Dylan's hand froze mid-motion, the coffee cup barely reaching his lips. His brows knit together. "I remember. Why?" "There were these kids." Henry's voice was quieter now, edged with unease. 2 boys. Twins. I saw them today, outside a diner. Dylan, they look like me. Dylan leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Henry, you know confidentiality. Dylan, Henry interrupted, his voice steady but laced with urgency. This isn't about curiosity or privacy. I'm telling you, they looked exactly like me. I can't ignore this. A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Dylan studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the gravity of the request. Then he sighed, setting the cup down. Look, Dylan said, his tone softer now. I can't legally confirm anything. You know that. Henry's jaw tightened. And, unofficially? There was another pause, longer than before. Dylan ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his reluctance palpable. Unofficially, you're not wrong. He spoke in a measured, almost reluctant manner. There was a case. 5 years ago, a woman came to the clinic, single. She was approved for a procedure, and we used your sample. The room seemed to shrink around Henry, the words reverberating in his mind. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. Her name? Dylan hesitated again, clearly wrestling with his professional ethics. Joyce Livingston, he said finally. She lives in this city. Henry sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. The name was unfamiliar, but it felt heavy with meaning. He tried to process the revelation, but his thoughts jumbled together, a chaotic tangle of questions and emotions. Does she know? He asked, his voice quieter now. She doesn't know who you are, Dylan replied. The process is anonymous. For her, it was never about finding a father. It was about having a family. Henry nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. He barely registered Dylan's words as he stood to leave. His friend called after him, a note of warning in his tone. Henry, Dylan said firmly, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. But the door was already closing behind him, and Henry was stepping into the cool night air. For the first time in years, the carefully constructed scaffolding of his life felt unstable, as though one misstep could send everything tumbling down. And for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to catch it. The quiet hum of the diner after hours felt like a small victory to Joyce Livingston. She stood behind the counter, wiping down the last of the booths as the evening shift wound to a close. Her hands worked methodically, her body moving with the rhythm of long-ingrained habit. Beyond the diner's smudged glass windows, the Texas night stretched wide and dark, stars faintly flickering in the distance. It hadn't been easy, starting over here. 5 years ago, she'd left Vermont with nothing but a battered suitcase and a heart bruised by years of fear. Her ex-husband, Bruce, had been a man who controlled more than he loved, whose words cut as sharply as his fists. For too long, she had convinced herself that things would change, that his rage would soften, that the positive days would return. But the positive days had grown fewer, and the violence had crept in like a shadow, relentless and consuming. She etched the day she left like a scar into her memory. She had waited until he was out, packed her belongings in silence, and slipped out the door with trembling hands. She'd driven south for hours, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, until the small Vermont towns gave way to the endless highways of Texas. Here, she had found anonymity and, slowly, a semblance of peace. Joyce's boys, Austin and Justin, had been her salvation. Even before they were born, they gave her purpose. The decision to go through with artificial insemination at the clinic had been the most terrifying and liberating choice she'd ever made. After Bruce, she had sworn off men entirely, but the longing for a family hadn't dimmed. She wanted children, but not the chaos of another volatile relationship. A social worker she'd met recommended a clinic in Austin, offering her a chance at something she thought impossible: building a family on her own terms. The process was a flurry of paperwork, medical consultations, and cautious hope. She hadn't cared much about the donor details. All she knew was that he was anonymous, healthy, and educated. She hadn't been searching for a father for her children, just a way to bring them into the world. And now, they were her world. Every ounce of exhaustion from double shifts at the diner melted when she came home to their laughter. Austin, the more adventurous of the two, always found a way to get into mischief, while Justin, quieter and more introspective, was content with puzzles or his well-worn picture books. They were each other's mirrors, yet entirely their own. Joyce glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:10 p.m. The boys would be waiting for her outside with Mrs. Harper, the elderly neighbor who watched them during her shifts. Setting down the rag, she untied her apron and grabbed her coat. As she stepped into the warm night, the sight of her sons greeted her like sunlight after rain. Austin was hanging from the lamppost, his sneakers scraping against the ground as Justin laughed, pointing at him. Mrs. Harper sat nearby on a bench, knitting something in the dim glow of the streetlight. "Mommy!" Justin spotted her first, waving enthusiastically. Austin let go of the pole and came running, his cheeks flushed from play. Joyce crouched to their level, pulling both boys into a hug. "Were you suitable for Mrs. Harper?" she asked, feigning a stern look. Justin was, Austin admitted, his mischievous grin giving him away. "He was climbing everything," Justin added, tugging on Joyce's sleeve for emphasis. "Well, no surprise there," Joyce said, smiling. "Come on, let's get home." She thanked Mrs. Harper before ushering the boys down the sidewalk. Their chatter filled the quiet as they recounted their adventures, Austin gesturing wildly while Justin corrected him in his soft-spoken way. Joyce's heart swelled with a familiar ache, a mixture of pride and gratitude that she often felt when she watched them. They were hers, completely and unconditionally, and they made every struggle worth it. The next day at the diner, Joyce found herself recounting the same routine, but something felt off. It was the man in the tailored suit who had caught her eye yesterday. He had sat at the corner booth, a stark contrast to the regulars in their worn flannel and denim. He hadn't spoken much, but his presence had lingered, intense, watchful. And then there was the way he looked at her boys. It hadn't been predatory, she was sure of that. If anything, it was curious, pensive, but it had unsettled her all the same. People didn't usually notice her sons in a way that made her feel exposed, as though the carefully built walls of her life were suddenly see-through. Shaking off the thought, Joyce turned back to her work. The man, whoever he was probably just passing through. He wouldn't remember her or the boys, and that was fine. She didn't need any new complications in her life. But as she scrubbed the counter, a part of her couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see those piercing eyes watching again. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, her chest tightened at the thought. The hospital corridors were silent, except for the faint squeak of rubber-soled shoes against polished floors. Henry Patterson adjusted the cuffs of his crisp shirt, his steps deliberate as he made his way toward the private clinic wing. His health checkups were a ritual, like everything else in his life, precise, calculated, and necessary. However, on this particular day, his mental state was significantly diminished. He hadn't slept well since his conversation with Dylan. The name Joyce Livingston echoed in his thoughts, the image of the two boys imprinted on his mind. He'd told himself he wouldn't act on the revelation, yet here he was, unable to shake the need to understand. The polished surface of his life was starting to show cracks, and he wasn't sure how to smooth them over. As he rounded a corner, a voice caught his attention, a soft, soothing tone, tinged with worry. Instinctively, he slowed down and peered into a room with a slightly ajar door. Inside, Joyce sat by the bedside of a pale, frail-looking boy. Justin. Henry's heart pounded. There was no mistaking him now. The same piercing eyes, the slight dimple in his cheek. Propped against a mountain of pillows, Justin's small chest rose and fell with labored breaths. Joyce was holding his hand, her thumb stroking the back of it in steady, comforting circles. "Breathe easy, sweetheart," she murmured. "We'll be home soon." Justin's reply was barely audible, but Joyce smiled as though he'd told her the funniest joke. The tenderness in her expression stirred something deep within Henry, something uncomfortably close to longing. Later, as Henry completed his checkup, he found himself lingering near the nurse's station. His voice was low, careful. "The boy in room 214 is Justin Livingston. Is he all right?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes darting around as though weighing the confidentiality policy against her instinct to reassure. "He's stable," she said eventually. "But it's a recurring condition, chronic pneumonia. His mum's been incredible, though. Always here, always fighting for him." Henry nodded, though the answer offered little relief. With his mind already set, he watched the nurse turn away. It wasn't difficult to arrange. Money opened doors and loosened policies, though he took care to be discreet. By the time Joyce left the room, exhausted but still carrying that aura of unyielding strength, Justin's bills had been quietly paid in full. Henry told himself it was a gesture, nothing more. He had no intention of intruding, no desire to disrupt her carefully built life. However, as he left the building and made his way to his car, he couldn't shake the sensation that he had crossed an invisible boundary. The confrontation came faster than he expected. "Excuse me." Her voice carried across the parking lot, firm and steady. He turned to see Joyce marching toward him, Justin resting against her hip, half asleep. Joyce's face flushed, her brows drawn into a frown that barely concealed her confusion. "I don't know who you think you are," she began, stopping just short of his personal space. "But I know it was you who paid those bills." "Why?" Henry straightened, his hands slipping into his pockets. "It was nothing," he said simply, his tone as calm as hers was fiery. "Consider it a small gesture." "Small?" She let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. "Medical bills aren't small, Mr. Patterson. What do you want from us?" Her directness surprised him. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze shifting to Justin, whose head lolled sleepily against her shoulder. The boy's tiny hand clutched her shirt, and something tightened in Henry's chest. "I don't want anything," he said finally. "I saw your son, and I wanted to help. That's all." Joyce's frown deepened. People don't just help strangers for no reason. You're not just some guy passing through. Who are you? Henry hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing heavily on his tongue. But he couldn't tell her. Not here. Not now. Instead, he spoke in a quieter tone. Just someone who recognizes courage when he sees it. Joyce studied him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, she shifted Justin in her arms, her movements more defensive than before. "Stay away from us," she said, her tone low but firm. "We don't need your help." She turned and walked away, holding her head high, despite the obvious weight she carried, before Henry could respond. He watched them disappear into the hospital, a strange mix of frustration and admiration simmering beneath his calm exterior. He didn't know what had compelled him to intervene, and he wasn't sure what he expected from the encounter. But as he stood alone in the parking lot, the faint scent of disinfectant still lingering in the air, one thing became clear. This wasn't over. This was far from over. The rhythmic beep of monitors filled the hospital room, a backdrop to the gentle rustling of Joyce smoothing Justin's blanket. Perched on the edge of the chair beside the bed, she maintained a straight back, despite the exhaustion etched on her features. Justin, though still pale, seemed more peaceful now, his breathing steadier than it had been earlier. Joyce glanced at her watch. Visiting hours would end soon, and she wondered if tonight would bring another restless sleep on the stiff pull-out cot at his bedside. A soft knock on the door startled her. She looked up to see Henry Patterson standing in the doorway, his polished demeanor slightly softened by the dim lighting. He hesitated, as though unsure whether to step in. "I don't recall inviting you," Joyce said, her voice calm but laced with a defensive edge. Henry nodded, stepping inside cautiously. "I know. But I wanted to see how he's doing." Joyce's eyes narrowed. "You don't have to check on us, Mr. Patterson. We're managing just fine." "I'm sure you are," he replied, his tone even. "But I'm not here to interfere. I just thought it might be time we talked." Joyce tilted her head, skepticism clear in her gaze. "Talk about what?" Henry glanced at Justin, then back at Joyce. "I want to talk about why I paid those bills. About why I've been watching from the sidelines instead of introducing myself properly." Joyce's grip on the armrest tightened. "So you do want something?" "No." Henry stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I owe you the truth." He pulled up the small stool at the foot of Justin's bed, his movements deliberate. For a moment, he looked down at his hands, his composure cracking ever so slightly. Then he met her eyes, his expression unreadable but earnest. "5 years ago, I donated to a fertility clinic," he began. "It was a decision I made without much thought, at least not the kind of thought it deserved. At the time, I told myself it was a beneficial thing to do. I had no idea where it would lead." Joyce stared at him, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. Although she remained silent, the tension in her posture conveyed a powerful message. "I didn't expect to meet you, or to see—" He gestured toward Justin, his voice catching slightly. "But the moment I did, I knew." "Knew what?" Joyce's voice was sharp, but not unkind. Henry said simply, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Austin and Justin. They're mine." Joyce exhaled sharply, the truth striking her like a physical blow. She leaned back, crossing her arms as if to shield herself. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with that information?" "I don't expect anything," Henry replied, his tone steady but quiet. "I just thought you deserved to know." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft beep of Justin's monitor. Then Joyce shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice low. "You walk into my life, into our lives, and just drop this on me. Like it's supposed to mean something?" "It does mean something," Henry said firmly, leaning forward. "It means that I have a responsibility to them. To you." Joyce's eyes flashed. "We don't need your responsibility. We've been fine on our own." Henry held her gaze, his expression softening. "I don't doubt that. But this isn't about what you need. It's about what I need. I've spent my whole life building something I thought mattered, only to realize I don't have anything real to show for it. And then I saw them." Joyce's defenses faltered, her expression shifting from anger to something more vulnerable. "I don't need you swooping in to fix things," she said, her voice quieter now. "We've worked hard for this life. I won't let anyone take that away." "I'm not here to take anything," Henry said, his voice dropping. "I just want to understand, to know them, if you'll let me." Joyce studied him, her brow furrowed. You can't just show up and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," Henry admitted, "and I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance." The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared vulnerability settling between them. Joyce glanced at Justin, his small frame rising and falling with each shallow breath. Her fierce protectiveness flared, but beneath it she felt the faint stirrings of something unexpected, the possibility of trust. "I'm uncertain about my ability to handle this situation," she finally uttered, her voice barely audible. "Letting someone in. It hasn't exactly worked out well for me." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking for all the doors to open at once. Just one. I'll earn the rest." Joyce met his eyes, searching for cracks in his sincerity and finding none. For the first time since he'd entered the room, her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. "We'll see," she said, her tone cautious, but not dismissive. "But I'm not making any promises." Henry smiled faintly, the tension between them easing into something softer, quieter. "Fair enough." And as the soft glow of the monitor bathed the room, the tender uncertainty of their connection lingered, unspoken but undeniably present. Henry returned home later than usual, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on his shoulders. The grand Patterson estate, with its sprawling gardens and echoing halls, felt emptier than ever as he stepped inside. He made his way to the sitting room, where a warm lamp cast a golden glow over his grandmother Martha's favorite chair. She looked up from her knitting, her wise eyes immediately noting the tension in his frame. "You're late tonight," Martha said, her voice gentle but curious. "Something on your mind, Henry?" He hesitated, loosening his tie and sinking into the armchair across from her. "I met someone," he began slowly. "A woman. And 2 boys." Martha set her knitting aside, her full attention now on him. "2 boys," she echoed, her brow furrowing slightly. "They're mine," Henry said, the words sounding surreal even as he spoke them. "Well, biologically at least. From a donation I made years ago." Martha's expression softened, her initial surprise giving way to understanding. "And this woman, their mother?" "Joyce," Henry said, his tone quieter now. "She's strong, independent. She's done everything for those boys on her own. But seeing them, knowing they're part of me, I don't know, Grandma. I feel like I owe them more than just walking away." Martha leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on his knee. "Henry, family isn't just about blood. It's about what you're willing to give of yourself. If you feel this is your path, then follow it." Before Henry could respond, the faint click of heels on marble reached their ears. They both turned toward the doorway just as Angela appeared, her carefully composed expression betraying the hint of something sharper, anger, or perhaps betrayal. "What's this about 2 boys?" she inquired, her tone cool and cutting. "And a woman." Henry straightened, his jaw tightening. The air in the room grew heavy as he met Angela's gaze, knowing the carefully controlled balance of his life had just begun to tip. The evening air in the Patterson estate was thick with unspoken tension as Angela Lindsay stood in the doorway, her perfectly arched brows raised in feigned curiosity. Her tailored red dress clung to her like armor, the sharp cut of her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She looked from Henry to Martha, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well?" Angela entered the room with a calculated grace, accustomed to commanding attention. "I'm waiting." Martha glanced at Henry, her expression calm but laced with concern. She stood slowly, smoothing the pleats of her skirt. "I think this is a conversation for the 2 of you," she said, her voice measured. "I'll leave you to it." If you're listening, would you like to stop and leave a listening sign? Comment below what minute the clock is reading as you listen to this story. We'd appreciate it. As Martha exited, her soft footsteps fading down the hall, Angela turned her sharp gaze back to Henry. 2 boys, a woman. Care to explain what's going on? Henry exhaled, standing and moving to the fireplace, where he rested a hand on the mantel. It's not what you think, Angela. She crossed her arms, her manicured nails tapping against her bicep. Oh, so it's nothing. The conversation lacked any discernible tone. Imagine my surprise when I hear my fiancé talking about children and some other woman. Her voice dripped with disdain. They're my biological sons, Henry said firmly, turning to face her. They are the result of a donation I made years ago. I only found out recently. Angela blinked, briefly taken aback. Sons? Plural? She let out a short, humorless laugh. This just gets better and better. Who is the mother? Who is she? Her name is Joyce Livingston, Henry replied. She's raising the boys on her own. I met them by chance and... Did you believe it was your responsibility to intervene and rescue the situation? Angela interrupted, her voice rising slightly. How noble of you, Henry. What exactly are you planning to do? Are you planning to play a game of happy family with a diner waitress and her children? Henry's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. This isn't about you, Angela. It's about doing what's right. They're my sons. I can't just ignore that. Angela's laugh was colder this time, her posture rigid as she took a step closer. Are you doing what's right? Since when do you care about things like that? Your life is here, with me, with the future we're building together. Henry squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze evenly. I care because it matters. Because they matter. Angela's smile faltered, and for a moment, her carefully composed exterior cracked. You think you can just add them into your life like some kind of accessory, she said, her voice sharper now. You're being reckless, Henry. Additionally, I will not permit you to discard everything in favor of a woman and 2 children whom you are unfamiliar with. Enough, Angela, Henry said, his tone low but firm. This isn't up for debate. I've made my decision. Angela stared at him, her expression darkening. Then, as if flicking a switch, she straightened, her smile returning with a venomous edge. Fine, she said coolly, if that's how you want to play it. Henry frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Angela stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. It means I've got news of my own. I was saving it for the right moment, but since we're sharing secrets... She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes gleaming. I'm pregnant. The words struck with the force of a thunderclap, immobilizing Henry. For a moment, he said nothing, his mind racing to catch up. Then his eyes narrowed. What? You heard me, Angela said, her smile widening. I'm pregnant, with your child. Henry's disbelief was palpable. That's impossible. Is it? Angela countered, her tone sweetly mocking. Henry, we've become engaged. Isn't this what you wanted? A perfect family? A perfect future? Henry was able to discern the glaringly obvious cracks in her facade. His voice was calm, though laced with steel. You're lying. Angela's smile faltered again, but she recovered quickly, shrugging with feigned indifference. Believe what you want, but if you think I'm going to let you ruin everything we've built together, you're sorely mistaken. As she walked away, her heels clicked sharply, leaving Henry alone by the fireplace. The weight of her words lingered in the air, but he felt no doubt about their falsity. The growing storm that Angela had just unleashed concerned him more. As the door closed behind her, Henry exhaled slowly, his mind already returning to Joyce and the boys. Regardless of Angela's strategy, it wouldn't undermine his deep-seated convictions. That evening, the Patterson estate brimmed with an unusual energy, signaling a gathering more driven by obligation than affection. Walter Patterson, Henry's father, presided at the head of the grand dining table, a man whose presence filled a room as much through expectation as stature. He beamed as Angela Lindsay entered, her every movement calculated for effect. Her crimson dress and poised demeanor drew approving glances from Walter, but Henry remained silent, his thoughts elsewhere. "My dear Angela," Walter said warmly, rising to kiss her cheek, "you're glowing tonight, and congratulations, such wonderful news." Angela's smile was radiant, yet beneath the surface lurked the shadow of her manipulations. "Thank you, Walter," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Henry and I are thrilled about the baby." Martha Patterson, seated near the middle of the table, set down her teacup deliberately. Her sharp eyes flicked between Angela and Henry, noting the tension in her grandson's stiff posture and the faint furrow in his brow. "A baby," she murmured, her voice calm but tinged with skepticism. "What an unexpected development." "Yes, isn't it?" Angela replied, her tone sugary sweet. "We couldn't be happier, could we, Henry?" Henry said nothing, his jaw tightening. Martha caught the flicker of frustration in his expression, and her suspicions deepened. Unaware of the underlying emotions, Walter slapped his hands together. "This is exactly why I knew you two were a perfect match. There's a Patterson heir to continue the legacy. Angela, you've always been a fine choice for Henry." Angela basked in the praise, casting a sidelong glance at Henry. "Well, I've always believed in building a future together, Walter." Martha leaned forward, her steely gaze settling on Angela. "And when is this little one expected?" she asked casually, though the sharp edge in her voice was unmistakable. Angela hesitated, her confidence flickering for the briefest moment. "Oh, it's still early," she said, recovering quickly. "We've only just found out." Martha nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "How fortunate," she said. "Henry, you must be overjoyed." Henry's gaze met his grandmother's, and for a moment, the room seemed to quiet down. "Actually," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to know more about this myself." Angela's smile froze. "Henry," she said lightly, "we've already discussed this." "No, we haven't," Henry replied, his tone firmer now. "In fact, you dropped this news on me just yesterday." Walter frowned, glancing between them. "Is there something I should know?" Martha cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention. "Perhaps we should ensure all the facts are in order before celebrating," she said smoothly. "It wouldn't do to rush into things without clarity." Angela bristled. "Martha, I assure you." But Martha raised a hand, silencing her with a quiet authority that commanded respect. "Angela, you're claiming to be carrying Henry's child. That's a significant assertion. I believe it's only fair that we verify it." Angela's cheeks flushed, the cracks in her composure widening. This is absurd. Why would I lie about something like this?" Martha's expression softened, though her gaze remained unyielding. "Angela, you've dedicated your career to securing your ideal position. Forgive me for questioning your motives." Henry stood, his voice calm but firm. "Grandma's right. If this is true, we'll support you. But if it's not..." Angela's face hardened, and she turned to Walter, her voice trembling with indignation. "Walter, are you really going to let them treat me like this?" Walter hesitated, his usual confidence shaken. "Angela, of course we believe you. But perhaps it's best to clear this up. Angela's mask cracked entirely, her voice rising. This is outrageous. Henry, you've always let others manipulate you, but I never thought you'd turn against me. It's not manipulation, Henry replied evenly. It's the truth. Martha rose from her seat, her commanding presence filling the room. Angela, enough. We both know Henry had a vasectomy years ago. Your claim lacks credibility, unless there has been a miraculous reversal. The silence that followed was deafening. Angela's face drained of color as the weight of Martha's words landed. Walter's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization, and he turned to Angela with a mix of shock and betrayal. You lied. He spoke, barely raising his voice above a whisper. Angela's gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape. I was trying to protect our future, she stammered. You thought wrong, Martha interjected, her voice like steel. Deceit has no place in this family, Angela. It's time for you to leave. Walter sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping as the truth settled over him. Angela, he said quietly, I trusted you. I chose you for Henry, because I believed in your character. But this... Angela opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself, realizing there was no redemption in their eyes. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, her heels echoing against the marble floor. As the tension in the room ebbed, Martha turned to Henry, her expression softening. You did well, Henry, she said. Standing by the truth takes courage. Henry nodded, the weight of the moment settling on him. Thank you, Grandma, for everything. Walter sank back into his chair, his face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. I can't believe this, he muttered. I thought she was the perfect match for you, Henry. Martha placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Sometimes, Walter, what seems perfect is only a facade. Real strength lies in authenticity. Henry met his grandmother's gaze, gratitude flickering in his eyes. Thank you, he said softly. Martha's expression softened. Henry, the foundation of a true family is not pretense. True family is based on love, trust, and selflessness. I've seen the way you talk about Joyce and those boys. If they're your path, don't let anyone, not even Angela, stand in your way. Henry nodded, the conviction in his heart growing stronger. As the tension in the room subsided, he was certain that his future lay not in the polished veneer of his old life, but in the messy, beautiful reality he had discovered with Joyce and the boys. As Henry arrived at Joyce Livingston's modest home, the Patterson estate faded from his memory. The tidy front yard, framed by an old oak tree and a weathered picket fence, radiated a quiet charm that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur he had grown up with. The house was small, but warm, its porch light casting a soft glow against the fading evening. Henry stepped out of his car, gripping the bouquet of daisies he had stopped to buy, a gesture that felt both natural and foreign. Joyce opened the door, her expression shifting from cautious to mildly surprised. She eyed the flowers with a quirk of her brow. Daisies, she asked, folding her arms across her chest. You don't strike me as a daisies kind of guy. Henry gave a small, sheepish smile. I wasn't sure what you liked, he admitted, so I figured simple was safe. Joyce hesitated, then took the bouquet, her fingers brushing his briefly. They're nice, she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. The inside of the house was cozy, filled with signs of a life built around two boisterous boys. A framed finger painting hung crookedly on the wall, toys scattered across the floor, and the scent of freshly baked cookies filled the air. Austin and Justin sat cross-legged on the living room rug, engrossed in a puzzle. At the sound of the door closing, They both looked up. "Henry!" Austin grinned, jumping to his feet. Justin followed more cautiously, his small hands clutching the edges of his shirt. "Hi, guys," Henry said, crouching to their level. "What are you working on?" "A puzzle," Austin exclaimed, grabbing Henry's hand to pull him toward it. "It features dinosaurs. Justin, show him the T-Rex." Justin hesitated, then held up a puzzle piece, his eyes darting between his brother and Henry. Slowly, his lips curved into a shy smile. Over the next hour, Henry found himself immersed in the boy's world. Austin chattered endlessly about dinosaurs, occasionally correcting Henry's misidentifications with exaggerated patience. Justin, though quieter, began to warm up, pointing to pieces and nodding enthusiastically when Henry got them right. Joyce watched from the kitchen, her lips twitching into an involuntary smile as Henry leaned closer to the boys, his polished exterior softening with each laugh and playful misstep. Joyce finally finished the puzzle and called the boys for their bedtime routine. They groaned, but obeyed, each giving Henry a quick hug before heading upstairs. Henry straightened, glancing at Joyce, who stood by the doorway, her arms crossed. "You're excellent with them," she said, her voice measured but not unkind. Henry shrugged, slipping his hands into his pockets. "They make it easy." Joyce studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" Sitting at the small round table, Joyce poured 2 cups and set one in front of Henry. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Henry took a sip, savoring the warmth before speaking. "They're incredible, you know," he said. "Austin's energy, Justin's quiet strength. You've done an amazing job." Joyce looked down at her cup, a faint smile playing on her lips. "They're my world," she said softly. "Every decision I've made, every sacrifice, it's all been for them." Henry nodded, his respect for her growing. "It shows." The conversation lingered there, in a space that felt safe but fragile, like a bridge slowly being built. Joyce's defenses remained, but there was a hint of trust beginning to bloom. As the evening wore on, Henry noticed a shift in Joyce's demeanor. She seemed more at ease, her guarded expressions giving way to moments of genuine warmth. But just as he was beginning to feel the tentative progress they were making, her phone buzzed on the counter. Joyce frowned, picking it up. The screen showed an unknown number. She declined the call and set the phone back down, but her hands lingered there for a moment, her expression tightening. "Everything okay?" Henry asked. Joyce forced a smile, brushing it off. "Just a telemarketer, probably." But Henry didn't miss the flicker of unease in her eyes. Later, as she walked him to the door, he noticed a small, nondescript package sitting on the porch. Joyce bent to pick it up, her brow furrowing. "What's that?" Henry asked. "I don't know," Joyce replied, turning the package over in her hands. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in messy handwriting. She opened it cautiously, revealing a single sheet of paper with a short, chilling message. "You can't hide forever." Her breath hitched and Henry stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "Joyce?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "It's nothing," she said quickly, crumpling the note. "Probably just a prank." But Henry wasn't convinced. He rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "If something's wrong, you need to tell me." Joyce hesitated, the vulnerability in her eyes stark. "It's probably nothing," she repeated, though her tone betrayed her doubt. Henry held her gaze, his determination unwavering. "You're not alone in this, Joyce. Whatever it is, we'll handle it." For a moment, she seemed to lean into his strength, her usual guardedness cracking. But as quickly as the moment came, it passed. She straightened, her walls going back up. Thanks, she said quietly, stepping back. Good night, Henry. Henry nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. As he walked to his car, he glanced back at the house, the warm glow from the windows a stark contrast to the shadows lurking around it. Something wasn't right, and he knew he wouldn't rest until he figured out what it was. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the old oak outside, swaying in the wind. Joyce sat in the living room, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring at the dim light coming from the boys' bedroom. Henry's earlier words replayed in her mind, his quiet assurance, a strange but welcome comfort. Yet unease gnawed at her, heightened by the cryptic note and the unknown call. Outside, in the shadows beyond the fence, a figure stood motionless. Bruce had been watching for weeks now, blending into the dark corners of Joyce's street. His face was gaunt, his clothes unkempt, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man consumed by resentment. He had seen Henry's car pull into the driveway, seen him enter the house with that bouquet of daisies, a sickeningly cheerful display that only deepened Bruce's anger. She had moved on, he realized bitterly. She had built a life without him. Worse, she seemed happy. Bruce clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had spent years spiraling after she left, years of unsuccessful luck, bad choices, and bitterness eating away at him. And now, here she was, living in her cozy little house, her kids thriving. A man like Henry Patterson, stepping in where Bruce had failed. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. The next evening, as dusk painted the sky in muted purples and greys, Bruce made his move. He waited until the boys were outside playing in the yard, their laughter piercing the stillness of the neighborhood. Then he approached, his footsteps deliberate, his shadow stretching long across the lawn. Austin was the first to notice, his laughter faltering as he looked up at the stranger. "Mom!" he called instinctively, his voice uncertain. Joyce appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from confusion to dread as she recognized the figure standing by the fence. "Bruce," she said, her voice steady but cold. "What are you doing here?" Bruce smirked, leaning casually against the gate. "Nice place you've got here, Joyce. Really homey. I see you've done well for yourself." "Leave," Joyce said firmly, stepping forward. Her body blocked the boys from his view, her protective instincts flaring. But Bruce didn't move. Instead, his gaze shifted to the boys, his smirk widening. "These must be the kids, huh? They must be named Austin and Justin, right? Cute names. Bet they don't know much about their old man." Joyce's heart pounded, panic creeping into her chest. "You're not their father," she snapped. "You have no right to be here." Bruce's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "No right," he growled, stepping closer. "I gave you years of my life, Joyce. Years. And you just walked away. Now I've discovered that you're playing house with a wealthy man. You think you can erase me?" The screen door slammed, and Henry emerged, his presence commanding despite the casual clothes he wore. His voice was calm, but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Bruce turned, his posture tensing as he sized Henry up. "So this is him, huh?" he sneered. "Is he the one with the shining armor?" "Who I am doesn't matter," Henry said, stepping to Joyce's side. "But I'll tell you this. You're not welcome here." Bruce laughed bitterly. "You think you can just step in and take what's mine?" "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Henry replied, his tone unwavering. "Now, leave, or I'll call the police." Bruce's face twisted with rage. "You don't know anything about her," he shouted, his words aimed at both Henry and the boys. "Ask her about me. Ask her about the kind of life she ran away from. She's not as perfect as she seems." Joyce flinched, her composure cracking as Justin peeked out from behind her, his small hand clutching her sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered. Henry knelt, placing a steady hand on Justin's shoulder. "Go inside with your brother," he said gently. "Everything's okay." The boys hesitated, but the calm authority in Henry's voice reassured them. They retreated into the house, their small footsteps echoing down the hall. When Henry straightened, his expression had hardened. "This is your last chance, Bruce. Leave, or I'll make you." Bruce snarled, his anger boiling over as he lunged forward, but Henry was ready. He stepped aside, grabbing Bruce's arm and twisting it behind him with practiced precision. Bruce struggled, but Henry held firm, his grip unyielding. "Let me go," Bruce spat, thrashing against Henry's hold. "Not until you listen," Henry said, his voice low and steady. "You don't scare her anymore. You don't have power here. Therefore, you will depart, with no intention of returning." The distant sound of sirens broke through the tension as Joyce, standing in the doorway with her phone in hand, met Henry's gaze. Relief and gratitude flickered in her eyes as the police car pulled up, its lights flashing red and blue. The officers handcuffed Bruce and led him away, his curses fading as they escorted him to the car. Henry stood silently, watching until the vehicle disappeared down the street. Inside, Joyce sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she held a mug of tea Henry had made for her. The boys were asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger that had loomed over their home. "Thank you," Joyce said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry sat beside her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm here, Joyce. For you and for them." For the first time in years, Joyce felt the weight of her fear begin to lift. Though the night had left them shaken, she realized she wasn't facing it alone anymore. And that, she thought, was a start. The next morning, sunlight streamed softly through the curtains of Joyce's modest home, casting a warm glow over the living room where Henry and Joyce sat in quiet conversation. The night's ordeal with Bruce still hung heavy in the air, but there was a palpable shift in the energy between them, a sense of safety, of beginnings, however fragile. Joyce sipped her tea, her hands still trembling faintly from the confrontation. "I thought I'd buried him for good," she said, her voice low. "For years, I kept my distance and did everything I could to disappear from his life, but he always finds a way to drag me back into that darkness." Henry's gaze was steady, unwavering. "He won't hurt you again," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." His certainty startled her. "Why?" she asked, looking at him directly. "Why do you care so much? You barely know us." Henry hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. Finally, he expressed his understanding of the potential consequences. "I see two incredible boys who deserve to feel safe, and a woman who sacrificed everything to give them a better life. I can't turn my back on that. I won't." Joyce looked away, her throat tightening. His words tapped into a deep place within her, one she'd guarded against potential hurt. She confessed, her voice barely audible above a whisper. "Especially not men." "You don't have to let me all the way in," Henry said gently. "Not yet. Just let me be here." Later that day, as Austin and Justin played in the yard, Henry joined them, his polished shoes long abandoned for sneakers he'd borrowed from Joyce. He helped them build a small fort out of cardboard boxes, his laughter mixing with theirs as they painted designs on the walls. "Henry, look!" Austin exclaimed, holding up a crudely drawn dinosaur. "It's a T-Rex." "It's a masterpiece," Henry said, crouching down to admire it. "However, I believe it may lack a tail." Justin giggled, handing Austin another crayon. For the first time since Henry had met him, Justin's smile was free of hesitation. The sight filled Henry with a quiet sense of pride. From the kitchen window, Joyce watched the scene unfold, her heart tugging in ways she hadn't expected. Henry's ease with the boys, his willingness to step into their world without hesitation, was unlike anything she'd seen before. And yet, a sliver of doubt lingered. Could she trust this? That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Henry sat with Joyce at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of him. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his tone thoughtful. Joyce raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" "A foundation," he said, leaning forward. He expressed his desire to assist families grappling with infertility. "I understand the challenges you've faced and the resilience required to start a family despite all obstacles. I want to create something that gives others that chance." Joyce blinked, taken aback. "You're serious?" "Completely," Henry said. "I don't want this life and this privilege to just benefit me. I want it to mean something." She studied him, searching for any trace of pretense, but found none. "And you want me to be part of it?" she said, more a statement than a question. Henry nodded. "You understand this better than anyone. Who better to help me shape it?" Joyce sat back, her mind racing. The idea was daunting, but also exciting. For so long, her life had been about survival, about protecting what she had. The thought of building something greater, something that could help others, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That's all I ask," Henry replied, his own smile warm and genuine. Over the next week, the foundation began to take shape in conversations over coffee, during breaks in the boys' games, and in the quiet moments when Henry and Joyce found themselves simply sitting together. For Joyce, it was a chance to channel her pain into purpose. For Henry, it was a way to redefine what his life could be. As the foundation grew, so did the bond between them. Henry became an integral part of their lives, his presence no longer feeling foreign, but rather natural, almost essential. He helped with school projects, taught the boys how to tie proper knots for their fort, and even burned a batch of cookies in an attempt to surprise them. But amid the laughter and progress, there were still quiet moments of vulnerability. Joyce would sometimes catch herself withdrawing, her fears resurfacing like old ghosts. Though determined, Henry struggled to decide when and how to tell the boys who he was. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Joyce turned to him, her expression soft but serious. "I'm scared," she admitted. She expressed her fear not only about Bruce, but also about the entire situation. "I am opening up to you, letting anyone in." Henry reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "I won't let you down," he said simply. "We'll figure this out. Together." And as the stars blinked into view above them, Joyce felt the faintest flicker of hope, a fragile, beautiful thing that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way forward. The warmth of the early summer sun bathed Joyce's backyard as laughter floated on the breeze. The small gathering was modest, but the sense of joy and connection was unmistakable. Martha Patterson sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the garden, her sharp eyes softened with a rare, genuine warmth as she watched Austin and Justin chase bubbles across the lawn. Henry stood nearby, sleeves rolled up, a relaxed smile tugging at his lips as he leaned against the porch railing. Joyce emerged from the kitchen, balancing a tray of lemonade and cookies. Dylan, Henry's oldest friend, quickly stood to help, his easy grin lighting up the moment. "Still trying to outdo my baking skills, Joyce?" he teased. "Someone has to keep the standards high," she quipped back, her laughter carrying through the air. The gathering was intimate but vibrant, a handful of close friends and family who had become integral to their lives. It was the first time in years that Joyce felt a sense of community, of belonging. For Henry, it was an experience he hadn't realized he'd been missing. A life defined not by deals or deadlines, but by simple human connections. After the meal, Martha called the group together. "I believe it's time for a toast," she announced, raising her glass. "To new beginnings, to healing, and to the courage it takes to build something meaningful, and to Joyce for opening her heart and home, and to my grandson Henry for finally learning what matters most." The group chuckled, but Henry's expression turned thoughtful. He glanced at Joyce, who met his gaze with a quiet smile. As the evening light began to fade, the boys tugged at Henry's hand, leading him to the makeshift photo corner they'd created with streamers and a cardboard cutout frame. "Family picture time," Austin declared, waving for Joyce to join them. Joyce hesitated for a moment, the word family settling heavily on her. But as she looked at the boys, at their beaming faces, and then at Henry, steady, patient, and wholly present, she stepped forward. Dylan held up the camera, his voice light but teasing. "Everyone say, 'New chapter!' 'New chapter!' they chorused, the moment captured in a single click. Later, as the guests began to trickle out, Martha approached Joyce, her movements slow but deliberate. "You've done well, my dear," Martha said, her voice soft but resolute. "The strength you've shown, the love you've given those boys, it's remarkable. And Henry, he's found something real with you." Joyce swallowed, emotions catching in her throat. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling. "I never thought I'd have this." Martha placed a hand on her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "You've earned it." That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Joyce and Henry sat on the porch, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. The sky above was clear, stars scattered like dust across a velvet backdrop. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," Joyce admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "where things felt normal. Good." Henry reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "You deserve this, Joyce. More than anyone I've ever known." She turned to him, searching his face. "So do you." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Henry broke the silence. "I want to tell them," he said, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "The boys. About who I am." Joyce's heart skipped, her protective instincts flaring momentarily. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the same sincerity that had been there from the start. She nodded slowly. "When the time is right." Henry smiled faintly, his relief evident. "Thank you." In the weeks that followed, the foundation they had envisioned began to take shape. Named after Austin and Justin, the Livingston-Patterson Foundation became a beacon of hope for families facing fertility challenges. Joyce took on a leadership role, her experience and compassion driving the mission forward, while Henry used his resources and influence to ensure its success. The boys remained blissfully unaware of the gravity of the changes around them, their days filled with school, play, and the unwavering presence of Henry. Slowly but surely, he became more than a visitor, more than a friend. He became a constant, a source of guidance, laughter, and quiet strength. On a sunny afternoon, Joyce stood by the window, watching as Henry helped the boys practice riding their bikes in the driveway. Austin wobbled precariously before regaining his balance, while Justin, ever cautious, held tightly to Henry's steady hand. The sight filled her with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. "Mommy, look!" Austin called, his voice brimming with excitement. "I'm doing it!" Joyce smiled, her heart swelling. "I see you, sweetheart." As Henry glanced back at her, their eyes met, and for the first time, She felt no doubt, no hesitation, just hope. The family portrait they had taken that evening at the gathering now hung in the hallway, a testament to the journey they had undertaken. It wasn't perfect, life rarely was, but it was real, and it was theirs. And in that small house, filled with laughter, love, and the promise of a brighter future, Joyce and Henry stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.